So basically, the project I'm working on is how race, ethnicity, and nationality is operationalized by law. What are the classifications? What mechanisms generally? How these mechanisms are translated into technical definitions and classifications. When it comes to identification and classification, there's two issues. One, how the law and how politics and define the groups, the communities, and the other set of discussion pertains to membership in the communities. Group boundary, in other words, group boundaries in two separate dimensions. Now, most of the discussion, or at least the one that's politically more prevalent, concerns membership in the communities, ethnic corruption, how it works. What I'm going to be talking about today is how the group and what questions may arise when we approach this issue from the concept of non-territorial autonomies, how the group is conceptualized in the Hungarian specific legislation, the law or laws, because there have been several versions of the law on ethnic and national minorities, and how the Roma in particular are positioned in these pieces of legislations, and what are the conceptualizing philosophies and techniques and methodologies that are involved here. I presume that some or most or maybe all of you are familiar with the Hungarian model, not because Hungary generally is that important or relevant, but it has been used as an interesting, progressive, or an interesting model for what's going on. And clearly, from our point of view, with certain simplification, you could say this is an interesting or a relevant model for non-territorial autonomy. Now, so this is what we have on one hand. On the other hand, we have the Roma, which of course needs no introduction. Europe's largest minority community. It's diverse. It's very dispersed. It's a diverse community. It would appear to be a perfect match for non-territorial constructs, right? It also kind of breaks the triadic, Brubakerian triadic model. We don't have a home state, so the home state, kin state, minority triangle doesn't work here because there's no kin state in this regard. So this would be, and also we know that there is a political commitment throughout Europe, to accommodate claims. So that's, my project here is, and again, there isn't going to be anything surprising about this, but I thought it would be an interesting sort of thought experiment how these models can be matched. So basically, what my argument is that the Roma case shows how the complexities and point to the inconsistencies of this minority or nationality self-government framework in Hungary and this policy design, and it shows the, I guess, limitations of NTAs for certain groups. Now, also as far as for the contribution of this, I guess, short project to Romani studies or people interested in what the Roma are, what I think the take-home message is, and why the NTA model is maybe one, but so I guess the failure, or what I say, is the insufficiency or the inefficiency of the Hungarian model doesn't necessarily prove that the Roma or NTAs are unfit for the Roma, or the Roma are unfit for NTAs. But certainly what I will argue, that the Hungarian model certainly doesn't seem to be working. The question is, and I think this is the take-home message, that we have a multifaceted, very complex group such as the Roma, and some of this is relevant stands for a large number of minorities, some not. But this is a very peculiar case where minorities would have very different claims. Some would want minority cultural rights, so the classic national minority rights. There's social inclusion policies that come into question. There's the policy demand to combat discrimination. And what the Hungarian case shows, that the inconsistent labeling of Roma as an ethnic, racial, or national minority reflects the lack of a consistent conceptualization of what the Roma are, and the lack of precise conceptualization of what social inclusion, anti-discrimination, or this cultural rights-oriented NTA sort of national minority rights protection mechanism should be about. Now, and this is basically the problem with the Hungarian case. I guess the other take-home message is, because we're interested in NTAs, what type of communities and what type of claims would NTAs be a good match for? So, talking about the Roma, the big question is, the million-euro question is, what are the Roma? Is it a social class, a race, ethnicity, or a national minority? Okay, well, of course we won't be able to answer the question, or the answer is obvious, all of these, but that's not going to be very helpful if we're looking at policy responses. So in general, what we see is that whatever communities we talk about, let's refer to them as minorities, the protective measures or the policy measures that we have can have a very wide range. Just to name a couple: socioeconomic equality, freedom of religion, protection of potential victims of pogroms, apartheid, discrimination, this brutal ethnic conflicts, decreasing cultural conflicts between the majorities, combating segregation, affirmative actions, symbolic policies, transitional justice. All these things sort of fall under the auspices of minority policies and minority rights. So it can be equal protection, participatory identity politics, cultural identity politics, affirmative. So all these issues come into play. I'm not going to be reading out the entire project. So what I'm interested in as a lawyer, lawyers are very good with coming up with terms and terminology and applying that, is we see that this sort of the traditional terminology of typologies, race, ethnicity, nationality. Of course, it's a very interesting field for scholars to dwell on, and we have that. But what I'm trying to point to that of course, terminology is not important on its own. What's important is the policy measures behind that, and what other political, legal instruments can match those demands or projects. So, what I will point at with the case of the Roma, that we have a complete inconsistency of how these terms are being applied, and again, the consequences will be pretty real for that. So, in my understanding, and when we talk about race, there's usually something with biology, with physical appearance, and usually in the context that is policy and legal measures. When they talk about race, it's usually the groups are identified by the perception of the others, and there's usually something discrimination or hate crimes, hate speech, so some kind of a protection from some sort of an attack from the others, from the majority, or from other groups, is in the center of, this is basically in the center of this, the core of this concept. So we see that some groups are and what I'm looking at to a certain degree is how various courts, for example, have identified certain groups to belong to this. So for example, Sikhs have been held to be a racial minority. When it comes to ethnic minorities, we see that while ethnic minorities are probably the most difficult to explain and conceptualize, they're both racial and national. We see that, so sometimes ethnic minorities are being referred to groups which would have cultural claims that national minorities would have. Obviously, the international legal terminology differentiates on the basis of whether there's a nation state around or not, but the issue is obviously more complex than that. Nationality or national minorities, of course, would be the easiest of the three. Well, if you look at it, look at for example, Council of Europe Framework Convention. So this is something that we would have, this is something that the territorial and non-territorial autonomies would be targeting culture claims, and these would be communities that would have sort of long-standing ties with their in their homelands. And okay, so we know all this now. So, but the important point here is that national minorities' claims bypass the anti-discriminatory logic, and again, we have cultural, political rights, linguistic rights, but again, and some sort of preferential treatment. Now, when we look at the Roma, we see that the Roma have been seen as racial minorities or a racial group when it comes to racial discrimination. And just to exemplify how this works, I'm citing a couple of UN and Council of Europe, so European Court of Human Rights cases. So we see that they have been both termed and perceived as a racial as well as an ethnic minority. Sometimes we see that the courts, this is pretty confusing for a scholar, but also I would say for any advocate, that the courts are sometimes using racial and ethnic interchangeable. That doesn't, again, really happen all the time. My point is that in many legislations. Obviously, the case study of Hungary is one of them. The Roma will be seen as a national minority. In the UK, it's also, you see, by the way, it's also, for me, it's, surprising that you have, that the courts talk about ethnic groups for the purposes of the Race Relations Act. I know that, it makes sense, but it's still, if you look at it, it's somewhat surprising. Okay, so Hungary, 1993, one of the first as you would probably know, one of the first important, not the first, but in the first parliamentary cycle of the first freely elected democratic government. The elections were held in 1990, after in post-communist or democratic Hungary. So this is one of the first major acts to be adopted in 1993, which as you know, is still an important point of reference for NTAs. It basically creates, recognizes 13 communities, with Roma one of them. All the others, Roma and the Ruthenians, except for Roma and Ruthenians, all the others would have national kin states so they would have nation states mostly in the neighboring countries. And there's a complicated procedure to extend the list. There have been some initiatives, but none has been successful so far. In 1993, there was in one of the proposals, the Jews were included, the Jewish community was included, but then the community actually rejected and asked not to be included as a national or ethnic minority. At the time, in 1993, the law spoke about national and ethnic minorities. Okay, so which I would say this is an MTA model, right? I think for simplicity's sake, we can agree on that. So it basically guarantees cultural and linguistic rights for the identified groups, autonomy in establishing and maintaining minority education, and we also have this unique Hungarian institution, the minority self-governments, which is kind of in a way intertwined with local and regional elements. So now it has two, but sometimes it comes back and forth whether there's a regional level or not. So these are elected bodies that have some competences, again, mostly pertaining to culture, heritage, language use, calendar, collecting names for the communities that could be then given to newborns. So Hungary doesn't have you can only choose first names from a list that the government approves. So there are study grants. And all sort of services that the MSGs, the minority self-governments, have been doing. Now, the function and the design of these self-governments is quite ambiguous. So it has political representation and empowerment, culture competences, and a vague promise of social integration and potential bundled together. Now, the mandate is limited to cultural autonomy, education, media, language, promotion of culture, and from the day it was adopted, it has been clouded by the phenomenon of ethnic corruption, that is, both in several dimensions. Members of the majority, so Hungarians running for these political elections as members of forming these sort of minority councils, and even within the communities there were disputes and this sort of accusations of non-genuine, actually non-members taking part in these projects. Now, for the Roma, what does this do for the Roma? You would think that this MTA is a perfect match for the Roma. Well, we see that it's a fundamentally flawed concept that offers the illusion of political power rather than genuine inclusion. So it marginalizes, this is something, the criticism, it's not only my position, but this is something that the literature emphasizes, it marginalizes Roma issues by depositing them in a parallel, fairly powerless, quasi-governmental structure. And what we see is that it has been a source of great and continuous frustration from Roma communities, because the expectation of these Roma councils would be assistance related to, housing, employment, discrimination, so social services is something that the Roma community would in a way would want. So what we see is that Roma leaders repeatedly call for redistribution rather than a recognition-oriented minority policy. Now, so there's generally, when it comes to Roma intellectuals, ever since the political transition, ever since these, these debates have surfaced, there's two competing sort of streams for identity and advocacy. a civil rights-oriented, emancipatory politics, an anti-discrimination and desegregation focused policy, and this sort of ethno-national culture identity-based sort of approaches are running parallel or in conflict at some point. So there's groupism and culture rights on the other hand. Now, what has happened so the 1993 Act went through a pretty, a somewhat significant amendment at some point in 2011 with Orban government having, adopting a new constitution, having a 2/3 majority of basically authorized with an authorization to do basically anything, and completely restructuring the entire public law scene. They basically adopted a new law that pretty much have copy-pasted the old one, so there's a new name for it. There are a few changes. So for example, they have abandoned the term ethnic, and now it's only national, it's the act on the rights of nationalities, so ethnic minorities have been replaced with nationalities. Now we don't know, and the term Roma has been officially included, Tsigan, the term Tsigan was used before. So we don't really know, we haven't seen any sort of governmental policy preparation documents or anything, whether this would have been the replacing or renaming whether there's a reconceptualization of the Roma as a national minority as opposed to an ethnic one. So we don't know, there's no evidence for overarching theoretical or conceptual reasoning or systematic political commitments. But what we see is that Roma minorities or Roma self-governments have now formally been involved in some social exclusion measures, sometimes even involved in community or policing measures. So it is if this was a confusing and vague and sort of very blurred model, it became even more blurred. Now, so this is what we see. What we also see is that the new law, along with the restructuring of the electoral system, has included a political representation. A very preferential mandates have been included for all 13 recognized national minorities in Hungary. And then at the same time, the number of parliament was almost reduced to almost half. So instead of 386, now we have 199 members in parliament, and you can have 13 of those could, in theory, be elected with this super preferential mandates for national minorities. So again, having this sort of uninterrupted pattern of ethnic corruption, it is a big question whether or not, for example, the government or a political party would use this, for example, in the upcoming spring elections to completely hijack the electoral system. Okay, so just to sum up, I know my time is up. So basically, what the 30 years of political transition or what is that, has shown that on the one hand, the Hungarian legislature conceptualizes Roma issues as foremost of identity politics. And cultural identity is through this NTA legislation or NTA framed legislation uses cultural identity as a tool for social integration, which in a way presents it as in an essentialist manner to break the culture of poverty, calls for the integration of social inclusion approach to Roma education and cultural programs. And this framework, the NTA framework, obviously does not include anti-discrimination or equal opportunities policies. At the same time, you had the opportunity to meet the deputy parliamentary commissioner. Before 2011, it was an independent ombuds office. So we see sort of a gradual but pretty important sort of downtoning of these protection mechanisms. In a conclusion, this NTA model for the Roma is clearly is unfit to meet the social inclusion demands of the Roma communities. It's also unfit for anti-discrimination tools and agendas. It completely fails to meet and comprehend the complexity of Roma-related issues. And even misses the essential difference between various policy models. This is why I had this lengthy introduction of what I see is the difference between minority rights and anti-discrimination, social inclusion, and how this translates into race, ethnicity, or nationality. It also neglects the individual justice-based, anti-discrimination-oriented approach. Generally what has been said of the Hungarian NTA model, that it was basically used as a bargaining policy for the rights of Hungarian ethnic Hungarians living in the neighboring countries. That's a separate discussion, but basically that was the most important criticism raised with the 1993 law. That was basically a window shopping, piece of legislation with very little Hungarian national minorities, except apart from the Roma. And this was used as a bargaining chip. And so some even say that at least the 1993 model, the entire Roma nation building project was essentially colonialist. It's a patriarchal endeavor lacking genuine grassroots initiatives. But, yes, okay, right. To be fair, and this is my last slide, in protection or in defense of the Hungarian framework, for the first time, the 1993 law formally recognized the Roma as a group with legitimate claims for a separate identity. Okay, it created a Roma political elite. It would have been politically and morally unacceptable to exclude the Roma from the listing, the enumeration of minorities. Again, even the Jews were included. They said, "Thank you, we don't want to take part of it." Just to prove this, there is an article proving that even in the debate of the law, the Roma was more commonly used than anything else, German or Slovak. So even so this clearly the legislator knew what they were talking about. And what my final point is that an NTA model is not to be and shouldn't be. So this is a minority rights framework model. It shouldn't be blamed for what it doesn't aim for, what it cannot do. It doesn't claim to provide an anti-discrimination protection. It doesn't claim to be a social a social inclusion, a holistic project for all minority and Roma related issues. However, as a last point, I found that the recent relabeling of the law and of this doesn't. Although it is somewhat controversial, but at least it clarified the scenario. It only foresees the Roma, this particular NTA-focused legislation sees the Roma as a national minority, as a nationality, and doesn't claim to be talking about something else. I mean, a criticism still stands that it derails public and political discussion from the other, I would even say, more relevant or pressing issues such as discrimination, social inclusion, etc. Thank you very much. Sorry for that.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for, you were a little longer than okay, but you also had a lot of input to give us, so I think it was okay that I gave you 2-3 more minutes. Any questions to András' presentation, comments? And then Boris?
Yeah, if I may just clarify, I mean, the 2011 law we're talking about, is that the amendment of the law on national minorities?
So there was an amendment to the law in this is a new law, but it practically copy pasted the old one. So it's called the new law, the 2011 law on nationalities.
But there was a law on social integration in 2014-15 or something like that, which didn't mention the Roma, but was purely focused on the Roma, right?
Okay. So sorry for.
I think it's called something the law, the equity law or something.
Yeah. So there have been separate pieces of legislation. So basically, the 1993 law was replaced by the 2011 one.
Yeah. Yes. I know.
And then there were other separate pieces of legislation that were not sort of brought under the auspices of minorities or this regard.
Yeah. I'm just asking because I was here with the advisory committee in 2016, I think, and that law had maybe it was just anti-discrimination something. Had just come out, and we had analyzed it before we came, and had come to the conclusion that it did anything but provide equity for the group that they wouldn't mention, and in fact, in a way, invited to assimilation of the Roma. And we had these discussions with the authorities, and they purely, of course, refused and everything. So I was just trying to distinguish those two.
So in 2003, a comprehensive anti-discrimination law was adopted to kind of provide a balance for this, which was a part of the EU accession legal requirement. It was basically a transposition of the race directive. And then all this sort of Roma social inclusion, policies started. So there were a lot of sort of, inclusion documents that were adopted. But,
may I add something, if it's possible? On the Jewish groups not wanting to be part of the enumerated or whatever groups. In Denmark, we have a similar situation that when the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities was signed and ratified by the Danish Parliament, the Jewish community said, no thank you, we're not interested. However, with all the issues that have happened, especially with terrorism at the global level hitting small Jewish communities, they have actually changed their opinion, and I think this is also the case in Hungary, right?
There was an initiative, so basically in order to extend the list of, so it's actually very interesting even from the theoretical point of view. So the law has a list of the 13 recognized minorities. In order for this to be extended, you need to have a popular initiative having a couple of thousand signatures collected, and then it's basically just like calling for an easier procedure than a referendum, and then Parliament would vote on it. You would have the National Electoral Committee upholding it. The Hungarian Academy of Sciences would need to approve, verify the existence, the 100-year presence and the existence of the communities. So basically there was an incentive on behalf of the Jewish community way back in the 90s, which was unsuccessful. They couldn't get enough signatures. So again, this kind of brings the question of agency. You have someone claims to be... Absolutely. It was this sort of... in 1993, it was this... the major sort of religious communities representatives were speaking on behalf of the Jewish community in 93. But again, the model said, okay, fine, if you have a grassroots alternative project, then, but again, there were simply not enough people to identify with this initiative. So it didn't...
The question of agency, isn't that also what you're implying in with regard to the Roma? Because, I mean, you have only rights as long as you can actually claim them. And if your group doesn't have this collective agency where they can actually claim and implement the rights that they, in a sense, own, then the law is kind of useless. Is that what you are...
Thank you. It is what I'm saying, but I'm also would claim that one of the benefits of this law that you actually now have a formally recognized representative of the community out there in the political terrain. You have a political elite, a Roma political elite. You know, there's a question how sophisticated, how much, how well they serve the interest of the community. Who is the community? One Roma says that you're not serving my interest. Who are, I don't know. Again, it's agency. Who is the judge? But at least, so that's for the take-home lesson on NTAs. That's also one of the benefits that you would you do create an entity that at least has some sort of authority to speak on behalf of the community, I would say.
There's an educational element to it.
Okay, guys?
Yeah, I have 3 points. The first one, I think you're absolutely accurate in saying what an NTA regulation can do. It's not, an NTA regulation is not there for social inclusion. That's not what an NTA should do. So I absolutely agree with you. The second is, you're posing this difficult question: who is who and who belongs and who is entitled to speak for the group. And if Timo allows me, I make a reference to Intervoy Estonia, where before a non-territorial council or a non-territorial autonomy could step into being, it was necessary that at least 50% of those who in the census indicated a minority, being part of a minority, also entered the name in the national register. And only if you had more than 50% of the national group, then it was entitled to form as a national autonomous group, and then they could have elections to their national councils. Because they wanted to avoid that, like maybe with the Roma, only 10% of those who are in the census say they're Roma, and then only a tiny minority of the minority makes the claim to speak for all the hundreds and thousands, and give them a louder voice in the public than they might deserve. And I was wondering whether such a regulation would be the case in Hungary as well. And I had this idea when you were talking about the Jews. You might at some point find 1,000 people, 1,000 Jews who say, okay, we want to constitute as a national group, and you might even find some Hungarian anti-Semites who would also sign because they would like to see them separated. But would then this tiny group of 1,000 people be entitled to speak on behalf of the Hungarian Jews? And this would be very problematic. With the Jews, it's most obvious because you have this confessionalization and nationalization trends. The third point, I'm trying, but I'm afraid I will not be good with it, but I'm trying to make a connection to Levente's yesterday's talk. With de facto autonomous agency in Romania of Romani courts or judges who are not recognized, but they are still there and do things autonomously. And I was wondering, I don't have a good question, but maybe you understand where I want to go. So, do you have similar things in Hungary, and how does this relate to a non-territorial autonomy legislation that does exist? Sorry for not being totally clear.
Thank you. Yes, I may have got. I didn't really get the question and not the common part of the first one, but let me start with that. So I think the reason why this is such an inspiring issue to talk about NTAs is that I would say that the limit is the sky. We can, I mean, social inclusion can in fact be, because we see that territorial autonomies are not going to work. I mean, the panel I was chairing here in the morning was with Israel and Palestine. That maybe is the only way to go ahead. And why stop at linguistic rights? You can, with digital democracy going on, why we could have, why you have Shire courts, you could have Roma courts, whatever.
Yeah, you could.
I mean, that's probably the way to go. I mean, it's technically we still haven't our lives have changed radically in all instances with the digital technology in the past 2 decades, and everyone thought that this is going to transform political life, and it hasn't really. We don't, in some Baltic countries we do see, but that's but these are all experimental models. So so I see that it could actually be somehow involved. In Hungary, to jump to your third question, we don't, this is Roma courts or anything that has not, and it's not even debated or even proposed to be debated. So I don't, this model is not. I'm still in a position that this has been, it still suffers from the consequences of being a window shopping model. With this, that it was in a way designed for ethnic Hungarians, rights, advocacy in 1993, and then
Yeah,
we're
that's
still.
That's not a crime.
But it kind of limits its potential to develop, unfortunately, because that's. But I mean, and to jump to your second question, I mean, it's and by the way, because I forgot to end that thing. So you have to have 1,000 signatures, and then the Hungarian Academy of Sciences will, our colleagues here, they have actually been, I couldn't disclose, confidential, but they have been, our colleagues, our friends have been giving opinions of, what certain minority communities should be ruled or not. But even whatever that happens, Parliament will still vote. So that's kind of interesting. A Parliament can just always disregard the grassroots initiative and the opinion of well-established scholars and just not, vote for it. And then the law doesn't get amended, so you don't get recognized. But yeah, so that's who gets to speak on behalf of the community? That's always a question. I mean, that can always be, and that actually is, I think, a very important, more ethical and moral question, because can one voice of dissent from the community delegitimize an entire discourse by saying that I'm a Roma and you don't represent me? Does that or what? So if we make arbitrary sort of thresholds and numbers, which we do, politicians, lawyers are no problems sketching up regimes with very intricate numerical designs and stuff.